so often, and so many of these psalms begin with a prayer, and the prayers are much the same on each occasion. And so in verse 1, he prays for two things, the third thing in verse 2. In verse 1, he says, "Hear me and help me." And in verse 2, he says, "Hide me." Notice he says in verse 1, "Hear my voice, O God." He's asking God to hear him, to hear his cry. And we know that God is a God who hears our cries. He heard the cries of the children of Israel in Egypt in the bondage that they were in. They cried out, and God heard their cries, and God responded to their cries. David has confidence that God will do the same, but he nonetheless asks God to hear his cry. Then he asks God to help me, he says, as he asks for God to preserve his life from the fear of the enemy. Preservation is help. He realizes that he is not going to make it if God doesn't help him. He realizes how dependent he is upon God for preservation. And then in verse 2, he says, "Hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked." He asks for God to be this shelter for him, to hide him away so that those that are hunting his life will not be able to find him and will not be able to take him. Beginning in verse 2, we see David's plight, and we want to spend a great deal more time talking about this, because there are some things that David says here that perhaps he's not said at other times or other places, and I think maybe this is the heart of what this psalm is about tonight. Now, as we take a look at David's plight, we want to begin in verse 2 by noticing the secret counsel. The secret counsel. David understood that his enemies had a secret counselor. His enemy, Absalom, I believe, is the enemy under consideration in this psalm. Now we know that David also fled from Saul, and there are some who take that interpretation of this psalm, that this psalm is about Saul when David was running from Saul. But it seems to better apply to David fleeing from his own son Absalom. And so that's kind of the interpretation, at least, that I will put upon it. But as we look at this secret counsel that David mentions in verse 2, we have reason to believe that this is Ahithophel. Now, Ahithophel had been David's counselor. He had been the one that David had relied on any number of occasions to tell him what to do. And if anyone knew the mind of David, and if anyone knew what David was likely to do, then it would have been Ahithophel. Ahithophel had been in on all of those meetings with David. He had been in those counseling sessions when no one else was there. And he knew David's heart, and he knew David's mind, and he knew David's habits. And he could be of great help to David because of that, but he also could be a great enemy, a great adversary to David because he knew David so well. And David was concerned about this secret counsel. He says, "Hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked." Now, if this counsel that David has in mind is Ahithophel, then David knows Ahithophel knows where I will go. Ahithophel knows the way I think. And Ahithophel will be able to find me. And so I need your help in hiding me from him. I need you to preserve and to protect my life. Now I want you to go back to 2 Samuel chapter 15. We're going to notice some verses that deal with Ahithophel because we're probably not all that familiar with that story, but it is crucial to understanding what David is saying here in this psalm about the counsel that is going against him. In 2 Samuel chapter 15 in verse 12, it says, "And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gileonite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilah, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom." And so the rebellion against David is ongoing, and it's growing in strength. More and more come over to the side of Absalom on a daily basis. And one of those that has come over to the side of Absalom is Ahithophel, David's counselor. Now, it seems pretty clear from what we can gather from the text that until Ahithophel went over to Absalom's side, David was holding up okay. The game was in David's favor at this point. David had the upper hand. He had the experience, he had the wisdom, he had what he needed on his side. But when Ahithophel goes over to the other side, the game changes almost immediately. And suddenly the battle is against David. And suddenly for the first time we begin to think, David might actually lose. The opposition against David is very strong. Some of you probably have been watching the NBA playoffs, and as you've been watching them, there were those that were predicted to win going in. Dallas, for example, was expected to do very, very well, and they went out in the first round. And there were others that were expected to do well and didn't do so well. And if you watched the game last night, and I didn't get to watch it last night, but of course with the Celtics and with Cleveland, everyone was expecting Cleveland being at home to win that game, and it didn't go that way at all. And it's amazing how that there can be these huge swings from one side to the other, where one's favored and then the other one is favored. And that's the way it was during this time in David's life. David had the upper hand, and all of a sudden, just in a matter of a short while, it reversed, and Absalom had the upper hand. And Ahithophel was a big part of that. Now, something that you have to understand about Ahithophel is that Ahithophel has a reason to go over to Absalom's side. Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba. And you know the sin that David committed with Bathsheba. That no doubt did not sit very well with Ahithophel. And you have to know as well about David's putting to death Uriah the Hittite. And you know that Ahithophel could not have liked that. After all, that was his grandson-in-law, one that was one of David's most trusted men, and so Ahithophel had reason to go over. And in fact, when we examine the counsel that Ahithophel is going to give to Absalom, it is going to be counsel that will be a way for Ahithophel to get even with David. Do you remember the first thing that he's going to tell Absalom to do? Go in to David's concubines. That had happened already, right? David had taken Bathsheba. That's a parallel situation. The second thing David had done is murder Uriah the Hittite. And guess what the second counsel of Ahithophel is going to be? Give me 12,000 men, and we will pursue David, and we will overtake David, and we will kill David. And Ahithophel's counsel is this: once we kill David, it'll be over. We'll kill that one man, and this will be over. That was David's very thinking in killing Uriah. If I kill Uriah, this will be over. This will be hidden. Nobody will know. But Ahithophel knew. And Ahithophel has reason to be angry with David. But going down through the context, and let's notice some of this, and you can see it unfold. But notice in verse 31 of 2 Samuel 15, it says, "And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Now, if you can read the words of David and understand the way in which this must have been said, David understood the seriousness of Ahithophel going over. And he knew that the only thing that could defeat Ahithophel and his counsel was God. And he's asking for God to help him, because he realizes what a serious matter this is. Notice 2 Samuel 16 and verse 15. It says, "And Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him." And so we see clearly Ahithophel is on his side. In verses 20 and 21 of chapter 16 of 2 Samuel, "Then said Absalom to Ahithophel, Give counsel among you what we shall do. And Ahithophel said unto Absalom, Go in unto thy father's concubines, which he hath left to keep the house, and all Israel shall hear that thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all that are with thee be strong." This is how you strengthen your hands, Absalom. You show Israel that there's no going back. When you do this, Israel will know there will not be a reconciliation between you and your father. They'll understand that this isn't something that's going to rise up and then go away. They'll understand that you're going to follow this to the end once you do this. You see, there were those, no doubt, that were reluctant to join Absalom. There were those that thought, what if Absalom loses? Or what if somehow David's done what he's done on any number of occasions, and David escapes and rallies and wins? Then if we side with Absalom, we're in a lot of trouble. We want to make sure that Absalom is committed. This was the way that Absalom proved that he was committed. He was in this to the end. Notice in verse 23, "And the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom." Now this has to do with the way that people felt about Ahithophel. The people had complete confidence in Ahithophel as a counselor. And they believed that if Ahithophel said it, it had to be right. And so when they see Ahithophel on the side of Absalom, and they know that Ahithophel is counseling Absalom, then naturally they're going to think Absalom's going to win. Absalom has the counsel of Ahithophel. He can't lose. And so Absalom certainly knew, and David certainly knew, the great difference that was made when Ahithophel went across. In 2 Samuel 17 and verse 1, it says, "Moreover, Ahithophel said unto Absalom, Let me now choose out 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue after David this night." Now this was the right counsel. This was the right thing to do. David was on the run. Absalom had the strength. The right counsel was overtake David quickly before David can rally his troops. You have him on the run. Don't give him a chance to rally. Don't give him a chance to gather his troops back up. Don't give him a chance to rest. Don't give him a chance to get entrenched somewhere. Get him while he's on the run. That's the right counsel. But you're going to find that it isn't followed. Notice verses 6 and 7. "And when Hushai was come to Absalom, Absalom spake unto him, saying, Ahithophel hath spoken after this manner. Shall we do after his saying? If not, speak thou. And Hushai said unto Absalom, The counsel that Ahithophel hath given is not good at this time." Now Hushai, the Archite, was the friend of David. And David had asked his friend, Hushai was one of the mighty men, he asked Hushai to go and pretend to be on Absalom's side. To go and be a spy for him. To go and help him in Absalom's ranks. And that's what Hushai does. And so Hushai comes in, and somebody might be thinking, well, why didn't Absalom know that Hushai was David's friend? And why didn't Absalom know that Hushai was one of David's mighty men? And why didn't Absalom know that Hushai would not have betrayed David? Well, you've got to look at it from Absalom's perspective. Every day, more and more people are coming over to him. In fact, some of David's most loyal servants have come over to Absalom. And Absalom is a prideful young man anyway. And Absalom sees no problem with Hushai coming over to his side. After all, Ahithophel did. After all, others did. And so Absalom didn't consider the fact that Hushai was not loyal to him. And so Hushai gives him counsel that is contrary to that which Ahithophel had given, which was the best counsel in this situation. And we're going to find that Absalom is going to listen to Hushai instead of Ahithophel. Now that's going to have several very serious repercussions. One repercussion is that David's going to get away. David's going to get to the wilderness. And that's going to be a battle that's going to play into David's hands more so than Absalom's hands. But another thing that's going to happen is it destroys Ahithophel. Ahithophel has a long record of being the counselor of the king. And the king always listens to him, and the king always does what he advises him to do. And now Absalom doesn't do that. And Ahithophel's destroyed. Ahithophel feels as if I've left David, I've come to Absalom, and now Absalom isn't listening to me. I'm in serious trouble. I'm in serious trouble because Absalom's going to lose, and I'm going to pay for my betrayal. Notice in verses 14 and 15 of 2 Samuel chapter 17, "And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord hath appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring evil upon Absalom." You see the guilty conscience that Absalom has? He has Ahithophel, he has David's counselor, but Absalom's thinking, I know I'm not supposed to be doing this, and I know the Lord couldn't possibly be on my side, and so what's going to happen is the Lord's going to give Ahithophel counsel that will cause me to lose. And so I can't listen to Ahithophel. I've got to listen to someone else. And so he's going to listen to Hushai instead of Ahithophel. David had prayed, God, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And God certainly is helping him in that way by keeping Absalom from believing this counsel. Notice in verse 15, Then said Hushai to Zadok and to Abiathar the priest, Thus and thus did Ahithophel counsel Absalom, and the elders of Israel, and thus have I counseled. And so their counsel is very, very different. Verses 21 and 23. Verse 21, It came to pass after they were departed that they came up out of the well and went and told King David, and said unto David, Arise and pass quickly over the water, for thus hath Ahithophel counseled against you. Then David arose, and all the people that were with him, and they passed over Jordan by the morning light. There lacked not one of them that was gone over Jordan. And when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his ass, and arose, and got him home to his house, to his city, and put his household in order, and hanged himself, and died, and was buried in the sepulchre of his father. Now we have a New Testament counterpart to Ahithophel, and of course that's Judas, who betrayed his friend as well, who went over to the enemy, who sold out his friend. That's what Ahithophel did. And of course the end of Ahithophel and the end of Judas were alike. They both hanged themselves because they realized that they had done wrong. So here we see the secret counsel that David's concerned about. The counsel of Ahithophel that's going against him. And he knows that. And so he's asking God for help, for preservation. But notice as well, as we go back to our outline, that we see the smear campaign that was started. In verses 3 and 4 of Psalm 64, David says of them who whet or sharpen their tongue like a sword, and bend their bows to shoot their arrows, even bitter arrows, that they may shoot in secret at the perfect. Suddenly do they shoot at him, and fear not. Then in verse 6, they search out iniquities. They accomplish a diligent search, both the inward thought of every one of them, and the heart is deep. Now as we look at this smear campaign, David uses very figurative language to describe it. He talks about them sharpening their tongue in the same way that a person would sharpen a sword to get ready for battle. Their tongues are sharp, he says. He says they bend their bows to shoot their arrows. The arrows, of course, are the words of their mouths. He says even bitter words, literally even poison arrows. The arrows that they're shooting are poison arrows. They're arrows that not only can kill because they're an arrow and they hit, but they're poison as well. They're certain to poison whatever and whoever they hit. That's the way that David describes their words. Notice he says concerning them in verse 4, they may shoot in secret at the perfect. And so they shoot secretly. That's one of the advantages of the bow over other weapons. It can be shot secretly. It makes very little, if any, noise. But it can be deadly. And that's the way it is with words. Words don't have to be shouted from rooftops. They can be whispered in back rooms. They can be very quiet. And yet they can be very deadly. But not only do they shoot secretly, he says in verse 4 that they shoot suddenly. Suddenly do they shoot at him. It's amazing how quickly arrows can be fired. It's amazing how quickly words can be spoken. And the damage they can do once they are can be a very quick type of thing. He says, and fear not. He says they shoot shamelessly. There's no shame to them in what they're doing. They shoot these arrows secretly. They shoot them suddenly. And there's no shame, there's no fear as they do this. There's a passage that I want you to notice. 2 Samuel 15 and verse 4. Let's notice that one quickly. We talked about it just a minute ago. But I want you to look at how quickly this thing is taking place. 2 Samuel 15 and verse 14. And David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly, and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. David understood how quickly this rebellion was taking on speed. And he knew that they had a small window of opportunity to get away. And had Hushai not been there, and had Hushai not stood against the counsel of Ahithophel, then Absalom would have had David within his grasp, had it not been for God's help and God's protection. But maybe the passage that stands out most in my mind in Psalm 64 is this, and that's verse 6. It says, They search out iniquities. They accomplish a diligent search. David pictures his enemies as digging up dirt on him. He says, some people go out and they dig for hidden treasure. He said, my enemies are digging up dirt on me. They search out iniquities. Did David have iniquities in his past? Absolutely. Absolutely he did. You remember the whole issue with Bathsheba and how much he tried to cover that up? Oh, that was in David's past. David knew that it was. There were those that knew about it. There were many who did not know about it. But they were digging out these things. You know what happens with every political campaign? There are people that are hired for no other purpose than go dig up what you can dig up. Go dig up what you can dig up about this person, about their back. Both sides do it. And we sometimes favor it when it favors us, and we're against it when it's against us. But nonetheless, it gets done. And it doesn't always even have to be true. It can take on a life of its own. It's just an opportunity to get something started, get something going. And that's what they were trying to do against David, turning the tide of public opinion against David. Consider a passage, Proverbs 16 and verse 27. I came across it today in this study and I thought it was interesting. Proverbs 16 and verse 27. It says, An ungodly man diggeth up evil, and in his lips there is a burning fire. An ungodly man diggeth up evil. Do you remember what Peter's going to say about love and about what love does? He says that love hideth a multitude of sins. That's what love does. Love says, let me cover this up. Love says, let me keep this hidden. Love says, let me try to protect someone. That's what love says. But the ungodly man says, let me dig it up. You know, there are things that are in people's past that have been taken care of. And yet people won't leave them buried. They dig them up. They continue to bring them back to the surface. They continue to bring them up as if they're still relevant. And that's sad. But that's what was happening to David. Now we know that David had repented of his sin. We have Psalm 51 and other passages where David had done that. Well, again, pride plays into that. And pride plays into Absalom. I mean, Absalom is beautiful, and the people are coming to Absalom, and the people are telling Absalom how great he is, and every day Absalom picks up new support. It's kind of like a political campaign, where someone's running for office, and the polls begin to come out, and they begin to see that they're going up in the polls. And they begin to have some early primary elections, and they begin to win those elections, and they begin to feel this tide of opinion turning in their favor. Absalom feels that. And Absalom knew that what he was doing was wrong. There's no question of that. Absalom knew that it was wrong. But Absalom believed that he could pull it off. He was convinced that he could pull it off. And every time somebody came over and supported him, he was more and more convinced that I can pull this off. And so at some point, he becomes so prideful and so full of himself that he ignores God and the part that God's going to play in this. It does. And David doesn't ignore that. Even when David's losing, even when the tide of public opinion is turning against David, David doesn't lose his faith in God. David has faith in God whether the people are with him or not. David has been through this before. He went through this with Saul. He went through this with others. And so David maintains his faith in God. In fact, the last of this psalm will tell us that. Notice verse 10. The righteous shall be glad in the Lord and shall trust in Him. And all the upright in heart shall glory. And so David's still trusting God. But Absalom is trusting in other things, at least at this moment. And so we see this smear campaign that's taking place against David. And that's what Absalom did. If you remember, Absalom setting up outside the gates of the city and people would come, and Absalom basically would tell the people, David's too busy for you. David's concerned with this and concerned with that, and so just tell me and I will help you. I'm here to tell you that type of thing happens in the church too. There are preachers that steer people away from the elders, doing the very same thing. I've seen it happen before. It's wrong. That's what Absalom did. He stole the hearts of the people. So here's this smear campaign. But you have to see the strong conspiracy. Notice that he says in verse 5, they encourage themselves in an evil matter. They commune of laying snares privily. They say, who shall see them? Notice that they're communing one with another. They're encouraging one with another. This conspiracy is strong. We're told in 2 Samuel 15 and verse 12 that it was strong against David. But now let's notice David's protection. In verse 7 we find that this great hinge that we often see in Scripture. Notice the little word but. But God shall shoot at them. They're shooting at David. And they're shooting at David suddenly. But guess who's on David's side? God is. And God is shooting at them. And notice in verse 7, that suddenly shall they be wounded. Now think about God as an archer. With a human archer, there is a limited range, but not so with God. With a human archer, there's limited vision, but not so with God. With a human archer, there is the chance that he will miss. But with God, there's no chance that he will miss. And so when God fights for David, David will win. Notice they would be destroyed by their own tongues. Psalm 64 and verse 8, so they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. Their tongues are like swords, but they're going to fall on their own swords. All that see them shall flee away. Those that are with them are going to run away from them. And that's exactly what happened. When Absalom was killed, Israel fled to her tents. The idea of a conspiracy, of a rebellion, of a revolt was over at that point. Remember Daniel's enemies said, throw him in the lion's den. Do you remember what happened to David, to Daniel's enemies? They got thrown in that same lion's den. Remember Haman? Build the gallows for Mordecai. But who ended up hanging from those gallows? Mordecai did. That's exactly what happened. And here it is in this case. They rise up against David, but they're the ones that are going to fall. The righteous are going to be glad and they're going to rejoice in God. If you look at Psalm 64 and verse 10, the righteous shall be glad. Can you imagine every day when the reports come in, of the strength that Absalom has, how much they must have rejoiced. It's like a political election, right? When the polls start coming in and one candidate is ahead. I don't know if you remember not this last election, but the election before when it was thought that President Bush would be defeated. And there was one news channel that even the next day would not declare the election. Just refused to declare it. Everyone else had declared it, but they would not declare it. Refused to do so. Why? Why? It's this very idea. That's not what our polls show. Our polls show we're stronger than that. We're holding out hope. And so Absalom must have been very glad every day as this happened. But now in the end, David's the one that's glad. The upright in heart shall glory. David's going to come out of this victorious. So David prays, preserve my life. David's plight is very, very serious, but God's protecting him, and David's going to be okay. I think we can see some parallels even to our lives today. Thank you very much for your attention tonight. Be Psalm 65, Lord willing, next time.